The mahogany dining table where I'd done homework for 12 years gleamed under the crystal chandelier as I watched my stepfather Richard slide the real estate contract across its polished surface. The house smelled of lemon furniture polish and the faint lavender sachets my mother had tucked into every drawer before she died 3 months ago. My name is Alex Morrison, and I've spent the last 15 years building a portfolio management company that specializes in distressed mortgage acquisitions. Most people in my family know me as the quiet stepchild who moved away after college and visits twice a year with polite conversation and expensive wine. What they don't know is that Morrison Capital Holdings, the investment firm I founded, controls over $200 million in real estate assets across 3 states. What they especially don't know is that 2 years ago, when this house went into foreclosure proceedings due to my mother's mounting medical bills, I quietly purchased the mortgage through one of my shell companies. Richard thinks he owns this house free and clear. He's about to learn otherwise. 30-day closing, Richard said to the real estate agent, his voice dripping with satisfaction as he initialed each page. Cash offer, no contingencies. This couldn't have worked out better. The agent, a thin woman in her 50s with nervous energy, nodded enthusiastically. The buyers are thrilled. They've been looking in this neighborhood for months. $3.2 million is an excellent price in today's market. I sat in the wingback chair near the window, the same chair where my mother used to read to me before Richard entered our lives when I was 10. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was watching him sell my childhood home while sitting in the spot where I'd felt most secure as a child. Alex, Richard called out, not bothering to turn around from his paperwork. I hope you're not expecting any sentimental nonsense about keeping things in the family. This house has been a financial burden since your mother got sick. My mother, Linda, had battled cancer for 3 years before it finally took her last October. The medical bills had been crushing. Experimental treatments, specialists, round-the-clock care. Richard had made a show of being the devoted husband, but I'd been the one quietly paying for the treatments through anonymous donations to her medical fund. He'd never known where that money came from. I understand the financial reality, I replied calmly, watching him sign his name with a gold pen that had been my mother's graduation gift to him 15 years ago. Richard finally turned to face me, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his expensive suit impeccable as always. At 62, he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades in corporate law before retiring early to manage my mother's modest inheritance. Good, he said, his gray eyes cold. Because this house was never yours anyway, was it? Linda and I bought it together. Real children inherit, not stepchildren. The words hit exactly as he'd intended them to. I'd heard variations of this sentiment from Richard for 25 years. Ever since he'd married my mother and made it clear that I was an inconvenience to be tolerated, not a family member to be embraced. The real estate agent shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Perhaps we should focus on the closing details, she suggested weakly. Of course, Richard smiled, turning his charm back on. Alex here has always been a bit sensitive about family matters. Never quite understood that marriage creates new dynamics. I watched him sign the final page with a flourish, then lean back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just solved all his problems. The house sale would net him nearly $3 million after fees and taxes. Combined with my mother's life insurance and retirement accounts, he was looking at a very comfortable future. There, he said, sliding the contract stack back to the agent. All done. I'll be out by the end of the month. The agent gathered her papers with visible relief. I'll get these to the title company first thing Monday morning. Congratulations, Mr. Harrison. This is a significant sale. After she left, Richard walked to the bar cart in the corner of the dining room and pulled out a bottle of champagne. Dom Perignon, the same brand he'd served at his wedding to my mother. Care to join me in a toast? He asked, already pouring himself a glass. To new beginnings and financial freedom. I shook my head. I should get going. Long drive back to the city. Suit yourself. He raised his glass toward the chandelier. To Linda, who would have wanted me to be practical about these things. The casual invocation of my mother's name to justify his greed made my stomach turn. Linda Morrison had been a high school English teacher who'd loved this house because of its built-in bookshelves and the garden where she could grow tomatoes. She'd never been practical about money. That had been Richard's domain, and he'd managed it with the cold efficiency of someone who viewed everything as a transaction. As I gathered my coat from the hall closet, Richard called out from the dining room. You know, Alex, you should think about what you want from the house before I finish packing. There might be some books or photographs you'd like to have. I paused at the front door, my hand on the brass knob that my mother had polished every Saturday morning for 15 years. Actually, Richard, I think everything will work out exactly as it should. The drive back to Manhattan gave me 3 hours to think about the events I'd set in motion 2 years ago. When my mother's cancer returned aggressively in her final year, the medical bills had started piling up faster than Richard could pay them. He'd refinanced the house twice, taken out personal loans, even borrowed against his retirement accounts. By the time she died, they were 6 months behind on mortgage payments and facing foreclosure. Richard had assumed the house would sell before the bank could act, giving him time to clear the debt and pocket the difference. What he didn't know was that Coastal Mortgage Solutions, the company that had purchased the mortgage from the original lender, was a subsidiary of Morrison Capital Holdings. I'd been watching the situation develop for months through my mortgage acquisition team. When the foreclosure paperwork was filed, I'd made sure Coastal Mortgage Solutions won the bid to purchase the debt. Richard had been so focused on my mother's care and his own financial juggling that he'd never looked closely at the changing paperwork. For 2 years he'd been making his monthly payments to a company I owned, thinking he was dealing with a typical mortgage servicing firm. The payments had been coming in regularly, which is why the foreclosure proceedings had been quietly suspended. But he'd never actually satisfied the original debt. According to the legal documents, he still owed $1.8 million on a mortgage that was now technically in default due to the missed payments from my mother's final illness. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I sat in my corner office overlooking Central Park. My assistant Jennifer knocked on the door at exactly 9 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone about to deliver significant news. "The Harrison matter," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Legal says everything is in order. The foreclosure notices were delivered this morning." I nodded, trying to ignore the twist in my stomach. This wasn't personal revenge, it was business. Richard had spent 25 years making it clear that I wasn't really family, that I had no claim to the life my mother had built before he entered it. Now he was learning that actions have consequences. "What's the timeline?" I asked. 30 days to cure the default or vacate. Given the amount owed and his current financial situation, legal doesn't think he'll be able to raise the funds. My phone rang before Jennifer could continue. The caller ID showed Richard's number earlier than I'd expected. "Alex." His voice sounded strained, none of the casual arrogance from Saturday's house sale. "I need to ask you something and I need you to be straight with me." "Of course. Do you know anything about a company called Coastal Mortgage Solutions?" I leaned back in my chair watching the traffic flow through Central Park 20 floors below. "It's a mortgage servicing company." "Why?" "They're claiming I'm in default on the house. But that's impossible, I just sold it. The closing is in 3 weeks." The confusion in his voice was almost painful to hear. Richard had always prided himself on his legal expertise, his ability to navigate complex financial situations. Now he was discovering that someone had outmaneuvered him completely. "What exactly are they claiming?" I asked. "That I defaulted on the mortgage 2 years ago when Linda got sick. That the house is technically still in foreclosure. But Alex, I've been making payments this whole time. I have bank records." "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" "I called Davidson this morning." Davidson was the attorney who'd handled the house sale paperwork. "He's reviewing the title search, but preliminary looks like there might be an issue with the chain of ownership." I listened to Richard's breathing on the other end of the line, hearing the first notes of real panic creeping into his voice. For 25 years he'd held all the cards in our relationship. He'd been the successful lawyer, the man my mother had chosen, the one who made the financial decisions and set the family boundaries. I'd been the tolerated stepchild who visited twice a year and kept my opinions to myself. "I'm sure it will work out," I said carefully. "These things usually do. Alex, I need to ask you a direct question and I need you to give me a direct answer." The formal tone told me he'd shifted into his lawyer mode, the voice he used when he sensed deception or hidden agendas. "Do you have any connection to Coastal Mortgage Solutions?" The question hung in the air between us. I could lie, deflect, buy myself more time. Or I could tell him the truth and deal with the consequences. "Why would you think that?" Because you've always been too smart for your own good, and you never forgave me for the way I handled your mother's estate planning. He wasn't wrong. When my mother was dying, Richard had made it clear that her will left everything to him, with a small trust fund for me that wouldn't mature until I turned 40. He'd presented it as Linda's decision, but I'd seen the legal documents. The will had been rewritten 3 months before her death, when she was heavily medicated and barely conscious. The estate planning was your decision, not hers, I said quietly. So this is revenge. You're going to destroy me financially because you didn't like your mother's will? This isn't about revenge, Richard. It's about consequences. The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the confident attorney, replaced by a man who was beginning to understand how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. How long have you owned the mortgage? 2 years. Since Linda got sick. Since you defaulted on the payments, yes. But I've been making payments. Every month on time. You've been making payments on the outstanding balance. You never cured the original default. Legally, the house has been mine for 2 years. I heard him sit down heavily, probably in the same dining room chair where he'd signed the sale papers 3 days earlier. The house sale. Can't proceed. You can't sell a property you don't legally own. Jesus Christ, Alex. Do you have any idea what this will do to me? The buyers, the real estate agent, my reputation, everything falls apart. For the first time in the conversation, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Richard wasn't a monster, just a man who'd let arrogance and greed cloud his judgment. But that sympathy was tempered by 25 years of being treated like an unwelcome outsider in my own family. You could have avoided this, I said. When Mom got sick, when the bills started piling up, you could have asked for help. I would have helped. Asked you for help? Alex, you were barely out of college when this started. I've been successful for longer than you think. Successful how? You work for some investment firm. I own the investment firm, Richard. Morrison Capital Holdings. We manage over $200 million in assets. The silence that followed told me he was finally understanding the scope of what had happened. The quiet stepchild he'd dismissed for decades had built a financial empire while he'd been focused on managing my mother's modest teacher's pension. Morrison Capital Holdings, he repeated slowly. The company that's been buying up distressed mortgages across the state. Among other things, yes. How long? How long what? How long have you been this successful? About 10 years. Since shortly after Mom's diagnosis. I heard him laugh, but there was no humor in it. So when I was worrying about paying for her treatments, when I was refinancing the house and borrowing against everything we had, you could have written a check for the whole thing. I did write checks. Anonymous donations to her medical fund, remember? Where did you think that money came from? I thought it was from some charity organization. It was from me. All of it. About $400,000 over 3 years. The number hit him like a physical blow. I could hear his breathing change, the realization sinking in that everything he thought he knew about the financial situation had been wrong. Why didn't you tell me? Because you made it clear that I wasn't really family. Because you rewrote Mom's will to cut me out of her estate. Because when she was dying, you were already planning how to spend the inheritance. That's not fair. Isn't it? You sold the house 3 days ago and toasted your financial freedom. 3 months after her funeral. Richard was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What happens now? Now you have 30 days to cure the default. The total amount owed, including penalties and fees, is $2.1 million. I don't have that kind of money. Not anymore. I know. So you're going to foreclose. I'm going to enforce the legal contract you signed. Alex, please. I know I haven't been. I know our relationship has been difficult. But this will destroy me. The house sale falling through, the foreclosure, the legal problems. I'll lose everything. For the first time in our conversation, Richard sounded like the man who'd been married to my mother for 15 years. Not the arrogant lawyer or the dismissive stepfather, but someone who was genuinely frightened and asking for help. You should have thought about that before you decided real children inherit and stepchildren don't. I was angry when I said that. Grief makes people say stupid things. You've been saying variations of that for 25 years, Richard. It wasn't grief talking, it was honesty. I hung up the phone and stared out at Central Park, watching joggers navigate the winding paths below. My mother would have been horrified by what I was doing. Linda Morrison had believed in forgiveness, in family, in giving people second chances even when they didn't deserve them. But my mother had also raised me to stand up for myself, to not let people treat me as less than I was worth. She taught me that respect is earned, not demanded, and that actions have consequences. 2 weeks later, Jennifer knocked on my office door again, this time carrying a single sheet of paper. "The Harrison property," she said, setting the document on my desk. "He's requesting a meeting." The letter was written on Richard's personal stationery, the same cream-colored paper he'd used for his law practice. His handwriting was shaky, unlike the confident script I remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes. "Alex," it read, "I understand now what I did wrong and I understand why you're doing this. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it. But I am asking for a chance to make things right. Can we meet? Just the two of us in the house one last time? There are things I need to say that I should have said years ago. Richard." I read the letter 3 times before making my decision. The house looked different when I arrived on Saturday afternoon. Richard had been packing for weeks, and the walls were bare of the family photographs that had documented my mother's life. Boxes were stacked in every room, labeled in Richard's precise handwriting: "Kitchen donate, Linda's books storage, legal files keep." I found him in the living room, sitting in my mother's favorite armchair with a photo album open on his lap. He looked older than his 62 years, his face gaunt and his expensive clothes hanging loose on his frame. "Thank you for coming," he said without looking up. "I wasn't sure you would. You said there were things you needed to say." He closed the photo album and set it carefully on the side table. It was the same album my mother had shown me every Christmas, filled with pictures of me growing up, school plays, graduation ceremonies, family vacations before Richard had joined our lives. "I need to apologize," he said. "Not because I think it will change your mind about the house, but because it's something I should have done years ago." I sat down on the couch across from him, in the same arrangement we'd had for countless awkward family conversations over the years. "I was jealous of you," he continued. "From the day I married your mother, I was jealous of the relationship you had with her. She loved you in a way that was complete and unconditional, and I was never sure she loved me the same way." The admission caught me off guard. In 25 years, Richard had never shown vulnerability, never suggested that he felt anything other than complete confidence in his place in my mother's life. "So I tried to diminish you. I treated you like an outsider because it made me feel more secure as her husband. I rewrote her will because I convinced myself that her primary loyalty should be to me, not to you." He picked up another photo album, this one filled with pictures from his wedding to my mother. They looked happy in the photos, genuinely in love, not like two people making a marriage of convenience. "She knew, didn't she?" I asked. "About the will?" Richard shook his head. "She was too sick by then to understand what she was signing. I told myself I was protecting her assets, making sure there wouldn't be any legal complications. But really I was just being petty and vindictive." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm about to lose everything and it's made me realize what actually matters." He gestured around the empty room. "This house, the money, the financial security, none of it means anything without the people you love. You could have realized that while she was alive." Yes, I could have. And I should have. But I was too proud and too scared to admit I was wrong. We sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the ghosts of family dinners and holiday celebrations, moments of manufactured happiness that had papered over years of underlying tension. "The house means something to you," Richard said finally. "It's where you grew up, where your mother raised you. I understand why you want to take it back. This isn't about taking it back. It's about never having given it up in the first place. What will you do with it?" I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. The practical answer was to sell it and add the proceeds to my investment portfolio. $3 million was significant money even for someone with my resources. But the practical answer wasn't the right answer. "I'm going to live in it," I said, surprising myself with the decision. "At least part of the time. Keep it as it was when she was alive." Richard nodded slowly. "She would have liked that." "What will you do?" "Start over, I suppose. I'm 62 but I'm not dead yet. Maybe go back to practicing law, help people with estate planning. try to do some good with whatever time I have left. As I prepared to leave, Richard walked me to the front door, the same ritual we'd performed hundreds of times over the years. But this time felt different, final in a way that had nothing to do with real estate transactions. "Alex," he said as I reached for the door handle. "I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Your mother would have been proud too. Thank you. And I'm sorry. For all of it. For treating you like you didn't belong, for the will, for not asking for your help when she was sick. You deserved better from me." I looked at him standing in the doorway of the house he was about to lose, this man who'd shaped so much of my adult life through his rejection and dismissal. The anger I'd carried for decades was still there, but it was tempered now by something closer to pity. "Goodbye, Richard. Goodbye, Alex." 6 months later, I was sitting in my mother's garden, reading in the late afternoon sunlight that filtered through the oak tree she'd planted when I was 12. The house was exactly as she'd left it, down to the lavender sachets in the drawers and the collection of teacups she'd gathered from antique shops across New England. Richard had moved to a small apartment across town and had indeed returned to practicing law, focusing on estate planning for elderly clients. We occasionally saw each other at the grocery store or the post office, exchanging polite nods and brief conversations about the weather. The foreclosure had made the local newspapers, described as a cautionary tale about the complexity of modern mortgage law. Richard's reputation had survived, helped by his decision to cooperate fully with the legal proceedings rather than fight a battle he couldn't win. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. "Quarterly reports are ready for your review. Morrison Capital Holdings up 23% this year." I set the phone aside without responding. The business would be there tomorrow, along with the meetings and conference calls and strategic decisions that had built my success. But this afternoon belonged to the garden, to the book in my lap, and to the memory of a woman who taught me that home isn't just a place. It's the people who love you unconditionally. The house had never been about revenge or financial gain. It had been about proving to myself that I belonged somewhere, that I had roots that couldn't be severed by legal documents or family politics. Richard had been right about one thing. Real children do inherit. They inherit the love, the memories, and the sense of belonging that no contract can ever take away. As the sun set behind the oak tree, I smiled and turned the page of my book, finally home.